The problem isn't any rendition that Mel Gibson might bring to this Passion story. The problem is in the Passion story. A literal rendition of the Passion story does in fact charge the Jews with the murder of Jesus. Matthew has a reluctant Pontius Pilate washing his hands, saying, "This man is innocent. I find nothing in him to charge him with." And he is forced out of his ambivalence or his reluctance by the bloodthirsty crowd, as Matthew tells the story. And the crowd says, "Let his blood be upon us and upon our children." There's the problem. Because, of course, Christians assume that that's a literal, factual rendering of what happened. That's because Christians assume that the Passion of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew was written by an eyewitness, probably soon after Jesus died. Jesus died in the year 30. Most Christians don't remember that the Gospel of Matthew, like the other Gospels, wasn't composed until decades later. So the ferocity of the Gospel story that has Jesus murdered by the Jews is coming out of a later period. It has nothing to do with who Jesus actually was, and it has nothing to do with who the Romans were. The Pontius Pilate was not a reluctant, benign, humane ruler. He was a brutal dictator who would have thought nothing of dispatching a troublemaking Nazarene. So what we have to do is learn a new way to read the Passion narrative. So the problem isn't Mel Gibson's movie. The problem is what Christians hear around the world every Good Friday. It's what they hear in the church when these texts are read. People have to hear these texts now as if they're Jews.
Well, how can anyone take this literal when you have contradictory reports right in the Gospels themselves?
Right, it's true. And if we read these things literally, we all have trouble. If you read the Old Testament literally in some of its passages, we have trouble. Are women really inferior to men? Are homosexuals forever to be condemned? I mean, these are problems that adhere in how we read our texts. But there's nothing more crucial than liberating the texts from the charge against the Jewish people. Now, one of the ironies is that since the Holocaust, when the movement that begins with the deicide charge in the New Testament leads through the centuries to a kind of anti-Jewish contempt, which leads eventually to anti-Semitic racism, which leads eventually to the genocidal racism of the Holocaust. It was at that point that Jews and Christians together began to peel back where this comes from. And it goes right back to that text, which is why in 1965, the Second Vatican Council issued its important statement, Nostra Aetate, which said what? It said, you cannot charge the Jewish people with the murder of Jesus. And the problem is, of course, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John continued to do that. But the church in 1965, having learned from the Holocaust where all of this leads, said, you cannot charge the Jewish people with the murder of Jesus. So whatever you do, however you read these texts, however you portray them on film, be careful. Do not do anything that reinforces the old lie that the Jewish people murdered Jesus.
But when they say, well, then who killed Jesus? If it wasn't the Jews, who killed him?
Two things I'd say to that. First of all, we know the Romans did it. We know that Jesus died. I mean, we know from various scholarly sources now that Jesus was one of those Jews in resistance to the Roman occupation. And that's the context within which to tell this story. The Gospels remember it as Jesus against the Jews. We know now from studies of history that it was Jesus with other Jews against the Romans. That's the context in which to tell this story. And that opposition somehow got him in trouble with Rome. and Rome killed him as a Jew. So that's who killed Jesus, and we should insist on that in a way that the Gospels don't.
Will, Mark Levin.
Door wasn't locked. Come on in, Mark.
How you doing?
Glad to meet you.
Good to
Glad
meet
see
you. I got the
My
crew with
God.
me. They never stop. Will Eisner.
Come on in, crowd.
Come on in.
It's like an invasion. This is where
Now this
I
is
work.
where you make your magic,
This
okay?
is where I work. Yeah, I'm usually manacled to this board. This is a page from a book I'm working on now called "The Plot." It has to do with the Protocols of Zion. I was surfing the net one day, and I was looking. I saw a thing called frauds. So I punched it, and up came the Elders of Zion. So I punched it further and got a copy of it. It was being broadcast by the Nations of Islam and Islamic. And I went through the whole thing, and I said, "Holy cow, this is really something." I realized that it was a well-known book, and it was used for anti-Semitic reasons. I'd known that, I'd heard about it and read about it, but I'd never actually read it through. I read it through and I said, "Oh boy, this something got to be done with this." My surprise came from the fact that people would believe this. Here is a thing that continues to be around without it being stopped. I refer to it in my book as a vampire that can't be killed. It's like talking to somebody who believes in a religion, of some weird religion. You're not going to talk him out of it. Every piece of evidence that he will give you may be fabricated evidence, but he believes it. I think this book survives largely because it is useful. If you are going to enslave somebody, or if you are going to create a difference between you and other people who look different, you are looking for evidence of that fact. It's the way they did during slavery, where they had, in this country, lots of guys were writing articles, learned articles about how African Americans were genetically inferior to us and so forth. So a guy might sit down and write a false document like that, a fabricated document. But if you were in the business of trying to keep these people down, you would use it. The Muslims are using anti-Jewish activity, anti-Zionistic, which is a euphemism for Jews, with the same intention. They want to bring the Jews down. They want to prove that they are right and the Jews are wrong and the Jews are oppressors. The trick is to adopt victimhood. Whoever can adopt victimhood first is going to win, because the world will go for the victims. And also, victimhood is necessary to keep their people together. The reason Hitler attacked Jews was he needed an enemy. Every dictator invariably has to have an enemy. They either go to war and create an enemy, or they have an internal enemy. Hitler's first statement was the Jews betrayed the Germans. They overlooked the fact that it was the English and the French that betrayed them, but they claimed it was Jews. It provided the basic, it was the Bible, if you will, of the Nazi concept. You got to understand that my feeling here is not one of blind rage. As a matter of fact, I'm not attempting to castigate the readers or to argue with the readers. All I'm doing is providing an evidence of the history of it, which fills a void that doesn't exist right now. And by showing the history, I'm showing the fact that it's a fraud.
So, Will, let me get this straight. The story you're telling in the plot is that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion actually was a forgery of a political pamphlet that was written in France in the mid 19th century. A man named Maurice Joly wrote a political pamphlet called Dialogues in Hell, and he created a fictional dialogue between the philosophers Montesquieu and Machiavelli, who were critiquing Napoleon III's imperial ambitions. And a Russian immigrant at the end of the 19th century, a gentleman named Golovinsky, got a hold of this. He copied it and then changed the names and put the Jews in there, and he claimed, I've got the secret plot of the Jews to run the world. And he got it to Moscow through this religious fanatic, Sergius Nihilus.
Passion of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew was written by an eyewitness probably soon after Jesus died. Jesus died in the year 30. Most Christians don't remember that the Gospel of Matthew, like the other Gospels, wasn't composed until decades later. Blood be upon us and upon our children. There's the problem. Because, of course, Christians assume that that's a literal, factual rendering of what happened. That's because Christians assume that the story does in fact charge the Jews with the murder of Jesus. Matthew has a reluctant Pontius Pilate washing his hands, saying, this man is innocent. I find nothing in. The problem isn't any rendition that Mel Gibson might bring to this Passion story. The problem is in the Passion story. A literal rendition of the Passion story and him to charge him with. And he is forced out of his ambivalence or his reluctance by the bloodthirsty crowd, as Matthew tells the story. And the crowd says, let his